you mentioned, you touched on this a little bit in your last response, but on your website, you also talk a little bit about a relational cultural theoretical perspective, the philosophy essentially that you use with your clients, with their therapy, and how it really aligns with feminism and multiculturalism and social justice. I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit more broadly about like the mental health space, what inequalities you see in the people that it does serve versus the people that it doesn't serve, and how you are trying to close that gap.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, this relational cultural theoretical orientation, the way that I implement this is, you know, we see each other as equals. So there's no, well, it's a both and kind of a situation.
Mhm.
So we see the power hierarchies that are even at play between the therapist and the client, because obviously the therapist has to own up to the fact that she holds power in the space or they hold power in the space, um, and um, and the therapist is not the person to dictate to the client what needs to happen. The client is the one who holds the power and is the expert on their own life, and the interaction between the two affects both humans. So that means that I'm also learning and growing as a human being because of the interaction that I'm having with a client. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be talking about my issues with the client or any of that, but it does mean that part of my work to be the most optimal, to give the most optimal services as a therapist that I could, I also have to reflect on the powers that I hold, the identities that I hold, the vulnerabilities that I have, um, and this concept of intersectionality, where we really look at a lot of the different identities that a person would hold and how they intersect with one another. So there could be some of my identities that I hold, where maybe I'm of upper middle class, but maybe I also am, a transgender man. And so, how do those two things interact with one another? So it's not just that, well, you have a lot of privilege in society because of this part of your identity. It's more complicated. So that's part of the orientation that I have with people is really being aware of my own identity and what I'm bringing into the room and how that might be interacting with their identity as well. And not a lot of people even have a lot of awareness about their own identity. And so part of my job sometimes is also to just kind of point out, like, I wonder if there was anything around, you know, um, X, Y, or Z in that conversation. What do you think? And so sometimes people can start to have awareness around that, and not because they're not interested in it, but I'm spending time educating myself on social justice issues, and so that's not something I would shy away from bringing into the space, if I feel like it could be helpful to somebody to share the knowledge that I have.
Absolutely. And have you seen that benefit your clients in any way by kind of adding in those elements to the conversation? Do you feel like it helps them in their healing?
Yes. I'll give an example from one of the groups that I run, South Asian Mental Health Support Group, where a lot of the conversation recently has been around just the internalized misogynism that happens, and even some of the things that some of the women in the group, they're mostly cisgender women, who uh, some of the elements of themselves that they would pride themselves on, like, you know, very outcome oriented, being very on time, very rigid, very whatever it might be. And we started to explore how a lot of those features were because they wanted to gain the uh, the esteem of the dad, of their fathers. And these are the kinds of characteristics that in a kind of patriarchal system or patriarchal culture, um, where certain skill sets are really valued and other skill sets are undervalued. And we might think of them as, sometimes we think of them as like decolonizing, a culture, and starting to understand, like, well, are these like colonial skill sets? We can also think of it as like, Are these more like, you know, skill sets that are adhered to a gender? And so are they gendered? And so just kind of exploring that inside of within themselves, uh, it started to create more conversation around and more insight around like, what do I like, what skill sets am I not valuing in myself?
Mhm.
Why am I always valuing this set of skill sets? And that really related to a lot of the stigma with mental health for this group that I've been running. And that then the conversation is like, well, some of the skill set that I didn't value is being vulnerable, being soft, um, being even having like feelings, being allowed to cry, being empathetic, being nurturing, um, nurturing to myself, and then a lot of information around judgment started to come out. Like I think I judged those parts of myself, and because of that, I judged the fact that I was even needing mental health, that
Mhm.
I wanted to do anything about my mental health because that addresses more of that softer side of myself, if I can call it softer.
Mhm.
Uh, and so, yeah, that's kind of an example of maybe how I see it playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that.